Captain Midnight.
When the screenwriters of Spider-Man Homecoming sat down to come up with a third big screen iteration of the character, they did something incredibly smart. They created a laundry list of things they felt they'd already seen over and over again in Spider-Man films. The list had obvious stuff like the spider bite moment or the death of Uncle Ben, but it also included some things that'd be easy to overlook, like the fact that every Spider-Man movie has included plenty of scenes of the character swinging around downtown Manhattan, and they made the decision from the very beginning that their film wouldn't include any of that stuff. Not because it was bad, but because it had been done. And when you're working on the second reboot of a film series that just ended 3 years ago, the last thing you can afford is to come across as stale. And it avoided that. I'm not saying that Homecoming is a perfect Spider-Man movie. It bears many of the same flaws that most Marvel movies do. The direction from the plucked from obscurity former indie filmmaker John Watts is solid, but nothing spectacular. And the score, composed by the usually excellent Michael Giacchino, felt mostly flat and uninspired to me. There's some great video essays out there about why these issues tend to plague the studio's movies. But you know what? When it comes to Spider-Man Homecoming, I really couldn't care less. And I think the reason for that goes a little bit deeper than the praise I keep hearing for the film. Marvel Studios just understands what makes their characters appealing in a way that other companies usually don't. Warning, this video contains mild spoilers for Spider-Man Homecoming.
Is he strong? Listen, bud, he's got brains.
Like, okay, take the new Spider-Man suit. Before the movie came out, a lot of fans, myself included, weren't so into this whole Spider-Man has his own AI thing. And there's still some elements of that are a bit too Iron Man Jr. for my taste. But about halfway through the film, it becomes obvious to me why they did it. They were coming up with the smart, in-universe explanation for doing things that the character has always done in the comics. Like, okay, take his eyes. While it really doesn't make much sense logically, artists, including Steve Ditko himself, Spider-Man's co-creator, have always used his eyes to express emotion. This really shouldn't make sense, but the reader accepts this because it helps the artist express what the character is going through. This technique has been used in probably thousands of Spider-Man comics, and it pops up in cartoons and video games too. But the previous two versions of Spider-Man on screen were unable to use this because it could easily come across as unrealistic in a live-action setting. The filmmakers still wanted Spider-Man to be able to express emotion with his face though, especially during the climax of their movies, so they always worked around the mask. How many times does Peter Parker have his mask shredded or thrown away in the last 20 minutes of a Spider-Man movie just because they wanted to give him the chance to emote? The answer is almost every movie. Even Homecoming indulges in this a bit because they take away the new suit in the last act. I understand why so many filmmakers have chosen to do this, but I think on some level it's a portrayal of the character. Stan Lee has said many times through the years that he believes that one of the biggest reasons Spider-Man took off is that anyone, from any walk of life, can project themselves onto him. You can't see his face like Superman, Batman, or Captain America. When he puts on that mask, he is Spider-Man. That's lost the second he rips off his mask in the climax of the movie and reveals, he's just the guy from The Social Network. By coming up with a reason why the eyes can move, Marvel was able to easily write themselves out of a problem that filmmakers have had since the 70s Spider-Man TV show, and allow them to use an old trick that comic artists have had up their sleeves since 1962. It may seem simple, but when you stop and think about it, it's pretty impressive. The same goes for Peter's AI buddy Karen. Karen is there for some easy laughs, sure, but like the Eye, she also manages to solve a long-standing problem in the Raimi and Webb films. I don't remember who said it, but there's this great quote I read online once, saying that the only character who talks to himself as often as Spider-Man is Hamlet. And that's very true. The dude cannot shut up. Whether he's chatting to himself about finding the Green Goblin's secret hideout, planning an elaborate photo for the Daily Bugle, or whining about his girl problems, Peter Parker delivers enough monologues to himself to make Aaron Sorkin jealous.
Is that supposed to be funny?
And in a comic book, that's completely fine, especially back when thought bubbles were still in vogue, and you can just easily have him thinking this stuff. But it's never translated well to film. The Raimi movies just don't have Spider-Man talk much in costume. Simple enough, I guess, but it changes the whole character. Spider-Man being overly talkative is one of his defining character traits. The web movies tried to correct this by having him talk more, but honestly, it just didn't work. It felt forced, and for whatever reason, when Andrew Garfield insults a villain during a fight, he comes off like an asshole in a way that the Spider-Man of the comics just doesn't. With Karen, Holland's Spider-Man is allowed to talk all he wants without it feeling weird. It's a smart get-out-of-jail-free card for the screenwriters, and it allows the character to have someone to bounce off of. I still think the suit went a little too far in some places. Spider-Man being able to identify criminals on the spot like he's RoboCop makes things a little too easy on the writers. But that was a trade-off that was worth it, to finally have Spider-Man act like, Spider-Man in his own movie.
Battery low!
Evil is no match for you! Enter Spider-Man Web Blaster, the Spider-Man Web...
Another thing I appreciated about Homecoming was how it was able to solve the Star Trek The Next Generation movie problem. Okay, I'm operating on like 6 levels of nerdery right now. Allow me to explain. One of my favorite things about The Next Generation, the TV show, is that the format allowed them to do smaller stories. Some days they'd be fighting the Borg, sure, but oftentimes they were just hanging out, playing cards, dealing with a transporter problem, or even just trying to get laid on the holodeck. God, this was a deeply dorky show. But then the movies happened, and all that stuff got chucked out the observation deck window in favor of stories about Earth getting blown up, or the Enterprise getting blown up, or Picard sneaking around air ducts like an elderly John McClane. Or, just Bruce Willis now. And not having a place for smaller, more creative sci-fi stories is a reason why most of those films aren't very well liked by Star Trek fans. And I think Spider-Man movies, even the great one, have suffered from this. Peter is always dealing with some massive problem. Doc Ock could destroy the city. The lizard wants to turn everyone in New York into, other lizards. My point is that the stakes always have to be incredibly high. This isn't the case in the comics. They've been around 55 years now, so as you can imagine, they've had plenty of time to explore smaller stories and experiment a little more. Not every issue has to be about shooting a giant laser into the sky. The best issues, in fact, usually aren't like that at all. Homecoming is the first movie in the franchise that seems to understand this, and is willing to follow Peter through the everyday process of just being Spider-Man. We see him give an old lady directions, stop a bike thief in a bank robbery, and even mistakenly web some poor guy that's just trying to get into his own car. This is the kind of material I grew up reading in Brian Michael Bendis' Ultimate Spider-Man, that usually just doesn't make it into big summer blockbusters. But Marvel Studios seems to know that this is the exact kind of thing that's been missing from Spider-Man movies. Their films have their flaws, sure, many of them are on display in Homecoming too, but they almost always manage to distill what people like about these characters into a film better than almost anyone else. And even when to take those characters into a new direction. Take the Vulture. The guy has never been one of my favorite Spider-Man villains, and when they announced that he'd be the main antagonist of the movie, I was underwhelmed. But I have to give credit to the screenwriting team, who, once again, were able to figure out just what makes a Spider-Man villain great. The thing that a great Spider-Man villain really needs is a personal connection to Peter Parker, not just Spider-Man. Sam Raimi understood this, and was able to deliver 2 great villains. He even attempted to do this again in Spider-Man 3 by retconning Sandman into Uncle Ben's death. But where that felt goofy and unearned, the personal twist in Homecoming not only plays super well when you see it in a packed theater, it also works on a thematic level, as it underlines the fact that Peter and Adrian Toomes come from the same background. And also that scene in the car was maybe the best one in the movie. And it's an instance of Marvel taking a chance on tweaking an old villain that makes him a better character and marks a big improvement over the last few films.
Is this more action than even Spider-Man can handle?
Spider-Man, a video game.
One last thing I want to talk about is how well Marvel is able to remix and reshape their classic stories. Now, the first 2 Raimi films were able to do this well too, take story elements from their source material and change them around enough to suit the story they were telling, while maintaining what made them great in the first place. But Homecoming has a scene that's a masterclass in how to do this well. You remember it, right? It's when Peter, who's had his fancy costume taken away, finds himself trapped under a mountain of concrete that the Vulture has just dropped on his head. This was clearly inspired by Amazing Spider-Man 33, where Spider-Man spends a lot of the issue trapped under some heavy machinery, does a lot of soul-searching about who he is and why he's made the decisions he's made, and ultimately summons the strength to break free. It might be my favorite issue of Lee and Ditko's original run on Spider-Man. It encapsulates everything that's great about the character. Homecoming has the scene play out very differently though, and I think it's the high point of Holland's performance. When he's trapped under the rubble and screaming for help, you suddenly remember that you're not watching Spider-Man, the character you've seen confidently swing through the streets of Manhattan so many times before. You're watching Peter Parker, a 15-year-old kid who thinks he's about to die and is panicking like anyone would. It's a pretty powerful moment in a film that's mostly breezy fun. And to me, it represents everything this film does right. Marvel Studios has been the Hollywood powerhouse for almost 10 years now, and they show no signs of slowing down. And I don't know how to feel about that sometimes. I like most of their movies, but I think there's some very legitimate criticisms that can be made on their effect on the film industry as a whole. But when I watch a movie like Spider-Man Homecoming, about a character that's always been so important to me, executed so well on screen where so many others have failed, I'm reminded of how they got there, by understanding their characters and bringing to the surface everything that fans have loved about them for decades. Hey, I hope you guys enjoyed that. I had a great time writing it. If you did, be sure to subscribe and like and maybe share it somewhere. Anyway, see you next week.
The big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started, because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes.